Hello and welcome to the Inside Carolina podcast. I'm your host, Jon Seiglie again. Tommy is back from vacation, but since I was with this motley crew of misfits the last time we talked about this topic, figured I'd come back around for a second go at it. I'm joined by Mike Ingersoll, Jason Staples, Buck Sanders. We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, the NCAA. Love it. But there actually was a lot of news that came out today. I don't know if anyone has seen it. But Mike, is your article live right now? I thought I saw some people talking about it, or is it going live later on?
I think it went live earlier today,
Okay.
Thursday around lunchtime.
Yep. So if anyone who is listening to this has not read Mike's article on the name, image, likeness changes that occurred today, you need to go read it. It is available on the Inside Carolina website, the Tar Pit Premium Message Board, might even be posted on the Basketball Premium Message Board as well. But go read that article. For those that have not read it already, we will be covering it a little bit in the podcast here. But guys, let's just jump right into it. And since Mike is the man of the hour, going to start off with him. Mike, I mean, just give us a quick bird's eye view of how the name, image, likenesses, how that changed today for college sports.
Yeah, so today, July 1, 2021 was the effective date for a lot of state legislation on name, image, and likeness. And so that we can go ahead and frame the conversation, when we talk about name, image, and likeness in the college athletics context, we're talking about the name, the face, the reputation, and everything associated with the college athlete. And this applies to all sports, not just revenue sports. All athletes are covered by this. And a number of states, and I don't have the list in front of me, but a number of states have enacted laws that became effective today, July 1st. Most other states, with the exception of West Virginia and maybe one or two, three others, most other states have at least something passed or in the pipeline that's at the least been proposed to be passed. That would give athletes the ability at state universities and private universities in the state where that legislation is passed to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. Right now, what the NCAA has done effective today to coincide with some of those earlier effective dates for the NIL laws, what the NCAA has done is it has issued what they call interim NIL guidance, and that comes with it's relatively short, it's fairly vague, and I think that's by design. And we'll get into sort of what the scope of that is. But essentially, the NCAA punts to, no pun intended, the NCAA punts to the colleges and universities to determine what their name, image, and likeness policy should be for their athletes. And this applies to the athletes under scholarship, walk-ons, doesn't really matter. And again, it applies to every single sport. So that's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about the developments in NIL and sort of what that's going to mean moving forward.
All right. Thanks, man. Buck, how about what was your take on today's events and really your thoughts when you saw what was coming out?
Like Mike, I've sort of been following this for a while, ever since the NCAA versus O'Bannon or O'Bannon versus NCAA killed college EA sports, which was a big deal. And everybody freaked out because at that time, EA Sports had a college game where it had every team in the NCAA or FBS at least, and you could, make a football team out of the current roster. Essentially, they didn't have the guys' names on the back of the jerseys, but they were the same height, same look, same number, played the same position as guys actually on the team. And when Claudia Wilkin, who is the same judge that was the judge in the Austin case that we talked about earlier, ruled that no, you can't do that without compensating the athletes. You're using their name, image, and likeness, and in no other universe is that possible without compensating the athlete. So at that time, and that's been a while back, what, 2014?
2009 was when O'Bannon was first brought. It then got consolidated with another case, the Keller litigation. That's Sam Keller, former Nebraska quarterback. That got consolidated, then they resolved it. It got deconsolidated, and then the O'Bannon case, from the antitrust perspective, the antitrust claims in the O'Bannon case were revived and put back before Claudia Wilken in 2014. That's what you're talking about. That's the case that ultimately went to the Ninth Circuit.
Yeah. So, even before then, when that case came out and we were just following it, even before the final ruling, it always seemed to me that, why should college football players or basketball players be treated any different than an Olympic athlete? For years and years and years, swimmers, skiers, you name it, could sign endorsement deals and so on and so forth, and not run afoul of the NCAA's eligibility rules. So to me, even back in 09, 010, 11, whatever, it seemed to me that, ultimately this was going to come down the pike, and it was just not going to be any way to stop it. They're just, and like the Austin case, and referring to the Austin case, the NCAA is not going to throw up any barriers to name, image, and likeness at this time, after being depantsed by the Supreme Court in the Austin case. So they had little opportunity, they had little choice but to say, okay, we're good with name, image, and likeness, because I think maybe they've spent $46 million this year in litigation. I think that's an accurate number. Right around 46 million litigating cases this year. And I guess one of their lawyers may have tapped them on the shoulder and said, maybe you're misspending some of this money here. We're not winning anything. But so
lawyers wouldn't do that, Buck. Come on now.
Well, that's probably true. Fight.
Says the lawyer. Yeah.
So I think, you could see this coming from a mile away, almost 10 years, almost a decade ago. You could see this day coming, as much as, the NCAA has tried to fight it. And now it's all about, how is this going to play out? That's the thing that everybody is thinking about. Who is it going to help? Who is it going to hurt? What's it going to mean? What's it going to look like? And for now, I think, for the next several months, it's going to kind of look like the Wild West. But then I think it's going to die down, and in about 3 or 4 months, we'll reach some sort of normalization with it. But fascinating topic to me, and I'm glad we've got Mike and Jason and you along to help explain it.
I don't know how much I'm going to be contributing. I'm going to leave it to Jason and Mike mostly here. But Jason, we haven't heard from you, man, from you yet. Sorry about that. And, let's just go ahead and go around the table, get your thoughts on today's happenings.
I think most of the preliminary stuff has already been said. I think one of the really interesting things that's going to come out of this is looking at how the schools basically move forward and what limitations they try to put on this, because they're all kind of the schools that are making these decisions they're kind of in a tough spot, because they know that if they err on the side of being lax, that the NCAA could come back and be like, oh yeah, well, that was obviously too much, and now we're going to penalize you, versus being too harsh on this and not allowing enough flexibility. And other institutions are definitely going to use that against them in recruiting and all sorts of things. So that's one thing that I'm keeping my eye on, is how different schools have handled this. I mean, I've found it fascinating how certain schools have so totally leaned into this. I mean, LSU released a whole hype video around our student athletes can now do this. You saw similar things at other schools around the country, where they're trying to communicate that look, we're on board with this for our students. for our student athletes. And that also is interesting. The other thing is, as Buck said, it may look like the Wild West initially. I actually think that the market's going to start out kind of small. For the most part, you're going to see things like, Armando Bacot, for example, just got announced. What was it? Is it it's an oyster bar or something like that?
Yeah.
That, it's like, these are small things, but I mean, they matter and they're a big deal for players. But I think that's most of what we're going to see initially, along with some memorabilia stuff and things like that will certainly help the star players for sure. I mean, the ones that are stars on teams are going to benefit from this the most. And then, your average player really isn't probably going to see a whole lot other than maybe, getting some free food now. I think that may be the biggest thing, is that the old Jameis Winston crab leg special is now something that you don't have to lie to the NCAA and say, yeah, well, I was walking out with it. I was intending to shoplift here, as opposed to I had a hookup where they were giving me, free seafood when, on occasion. Can't say that because the NCAA is going to bust you. Well, now, yeah, you can just, sign a deal with Publix or with, the oyster bar or whatever, where you like the food, and be like, hey, I'll actually give you guys a picture and, maybe do a couple things like this. And now you give me free food, no problem. So that, I think, is one of the other really interesting things about that, because every one of us knows that in every college town, I mean, even FCS college towns, you're going to get student athletes are going to get free food oftentimes. And this is something that I think makes things a lot easier in terms of enforcement for schools that don't have to worry about some of those things to the same degree now.
Yeah.
Well,
and
go ahead, John. No,
I was just going to say, so to clarify, the crab one that Baycott got was actually Jimmy's famous seafood. So
the Baltimore. Those are UNC guys.
There you go.
Jimmy's Seafood. Those are a bunch of UNC guys.
Yep. So some good icy stuff there. And then I was also gonna make a joke about Mike being old and on the NCAA football game at some point, but
I've got mine. I've got my copies in the fire safe upstairs.
What was your name in the game?
Oh, I can't remember what my name was. I will say that for the most part, they had my game day attire down to a T.
Really?
I mean, from what I recall, they even had, I wore an elbow sleeve on my left elbow, but not my right. And I think it might have been the 2010 version. It had the Utah quarterback on the cover. I think in that 2010 EA Sports College Football, I had a elbow sleeve on just one elbow and not the other. So, I mean, I was a nobody. So
detail.
The level of detail was pretty astonishing. And that's, what gave rise to, that's what made Ed O'Bannon go, wait a second, and ultimately filed the lawsuit.
Yep.
But Jason made a good point on who's going to be able to benefit from this early on. Knee-jerk reaction is it's going to be star players. But the other population to think about are these kids who have come in now with massive social media followings. So I saw a story today about a gymnast at LSU, little blonde girl. I think she might be a sophomore, maybe she's a junior. She came into college with millions of followers on TikTok and Instagram, and a couple 10,000 on Twitter. And it's fans need to remember that it's not unusual for people to monetize their social media followings. It's not unusual for folks to get a contract with, some company. We'll call it Olay moisturizer, and Olay will pay somebody, an influencer, quote unquote influencer, will pay them $100,000 for a couple tweets every week for an entire year, or they'll pay them $1 or $2 grand per tweet, or per Instagram post, or per product placement in a TikTok video. When you've got millions of followers, you become very valuable to these companies as an influencer of young people. If that's that company's target demographic, college age kids or younger, well, now with somebody who has millions and millions of social media followers, it's obvious. The product gets out there, you get not free advertising because you're paying for it, but it's more organic advertising. And that's really the way that a lot of these companies have started to move. They've started to use social media influencers. So now with this new NIL legislation, whether it's the school's policy or the NCAA's policy or state law, or the conference's policy, remember, we've got a whole bunch of things working here. But regardless of whichever policy the student athlete is required to follow based on the circumstances of the state that they go to school in, they can now monetize their social media accounts. And most of these young kids understand how social media works. They understand how to build a brand. They understand how to build a following. And it is all about getting followers and getting eyeballs and getting clicks and likes and things like that. And now they can turn that into actual dollars, whereas before they couldn't. And you don't need to use, for the most part, your school's logos, your school's marks, where you go to school. You don't really need all that once that follower base is established. Those advertisers, they don't care about really where you go to school if you already have the established follower base on social media. They just care about the number of people who have eyeballs on your account. And it doesn't matter that you play football at Alabama, or that you're a gymnast at LSU, or that you're a rower at Michigan. It doesn't matter. So that's where these kids, people worry about, well, how am I? Hey, one thing I've heard a lot from folks is, well, how are these kids supposed to really market themselves when they can't use the school's marks or logos?
Not hard.
It's not that hard. Some kids will be harder than others. And yes, I mean, we're kidding ourselves if we don't think that, the school you attend actually builds your personal brand. It absolutely does. You can piggyback off of the UNC brand. It's an established brand. It's a household name, things like that. And if you can't use the UNC logo, you can't use the UNC color scheme, in terms of trade dress, if it's a specific uniform pattern or something like that. If you can't use that, that might hamstring some kids a little bit. But not much. And one side point to make there is that not every school is going to restrict that either. Some schools, might allow kids, and I've seen this. I've seen some schools completely restrict the use of marks and logos belonging to the university. I've seen others that have thought about potentially just charging a licensing fee, like they'd charge anybody to use their mark or their logo. So again, you're going to see variation amongst the schools and variation amongst the conferences as to what's permissible. But that is a big population, student population, that stands to really benefit from this, and really make a lot of money off this deal, whereas before they could make nothing.
Yeah, and to build off of that, sorry, John, to build off of that, two things. One is in terms of the limitations, I would expect that a lot of schools that are more lax on the logo and that sort of thing. Basically, the restrictions that they're likely to put in place are, look, if we're a Nike school, you can't go on and have a bunch of Adidas like you can't do stuff with Adidas, and then have school issued gear on with that. That's the sort of thing that obviously it's a conflict. But beyond that, I mean, a lot of those schools,
maybe, and let's flesh that out here in a second. But so hold that thought. But go on.
That would be the sort of thing that I would expect, most schools to be like, well, if we've got an arrangement with, Winn-Dixie is the official grocery store of this school, you can't go in our school's stuff and talk about how great Publix is or whatever. So that's the sort of thing that that I would expect, although again there's some variation here, especially once you get into licensing charges and all that. But the other thing, and this is the bigger one, is when you're talking about Instagram influencer money, you talked about them earning decent money. I don't think a lot of the people listening to this, I suspect that a lot of the people listening to this are not aware of how much money there is available there. I mean, we're talking
kids could be millionaires by the end of this year, depending on what their social media following looks like.
Yeah, we're talking real money here. So I have in front of me the average cost of an Instagram post for an advertiser who wants an influencer to make a post that pushes their product in 2021. If you have 1 to 10,000 followers, you'll get somewhere between $10 and $100 per post is the going rate. And that's okay, right? But here I'm just going to jump up to, if you have over 100,000 followers, you can expect anywhere from $500 to $5,000 per post that features that product. If you have over 500,000 followers, you can expect anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 per post with that product. And if you have, like this gymnast that you mentioned, over 1 million followers, it's going to cost you $10,000 just to get into the discussion with that kind of influencer.
And so that's with every advertiser.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And so if you sign a deal with 4 advertisers to feature their products, and you're going to do
by lunch, you've made 40 grand.
By lunch, you've made 40 grand for 4 posts.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do, say, 1 post for each brand a month, you're making 40 grand a month. And that's for 1 million followers. If you have 4 or 5, that goes up. So you're talking about some real money with this. And actually the place that and you're bringing up the gymnast makes this this point really well. The scrub football player is not really going to benefit from this that much. Not much. They're going to benefit.
Yeah.
They'll have some benefits there. But what's interesting is a lot of the athletes in the non-revenue sports that actually have followings, they're going to benefit tremendously. So if you think about, for example, a softball player at one of the top softball school, I mean, you think if you're
Oklahoma.
my age,
Oklahoma.
Or if you're my age, you remember Jenny Finch.
Oh yeah. Arizona.
From Arizona. She was just absolutely dominant player and also a beautiful woman. And you take Jenny Finch in the Instagram era, she would have been a multimillionaire by her sophomore year because she was throwing it harder than anybody else. Her dad actually had a product called and still does, called the Finch Windmill that was to train basically a pitcher for better arm velocity to produce better velocity on the mound. And you take some of that stuff and you add this to the scholarship, and now those kids are making more money in college than they can make as influencers than they can make in a professional league. I mean, you're not going to make a ton of money per year from a WNBA team, but if you're an athlete at say Tennessee or UConn, and you have a following of 300,000 people who are following your Instagram or more. Some of those women's basketball players have more. I mean, the ones that are really top level.
Yeah.
The elite players or the elite athletes in non-revenue sports are going to massively benefit from this. And that's something that I think is not talked about as much because it's everybody wants to talk about the revenue sports that, the football players and the basketball players. And obviously the best football players are going to get some. And obviously the best basketball players are going to benefit mightily, but it's a lot of non-revenue sports athletes are really going to benefit from this, maybe even disproportionately compared to what some of the revenue sports guys might have already been getting below the table.
Well, so one thing you just brought up, Jason, was so what Jason's doing right now is he's looking at the fair market value for a post on social media. Fair market value is something that in my review of proposed NIL policies and the NCAA's interim policy and sort of following this now and actually working on it for a little while now, things that I've seen come out proposed from different places, from people, from schools, from the NCAA, from all over the place, is there was this idea floating around that most institutions that I'm aware of have just kind of gone away from. But originally there was this idea that maybe we can somehow restrict income or restrict the value of the contract, the NIL agreement that the player signs with whatever third party sponsor, vendor that is. We can restrict that to quote unquote fair market value. But then I never saw it defined. And what that did for me, the light bulb went off, or I guess the siren went off, because the fair market value up until literally today for college athletes' services to a university was zero, and it was artificially deflated to zero. That was the fair market value because the university's member conferences, along with the and then the broader NCAA, all decided that was going to be the fair market value. We determined the market. We are the market, colleges, universities, NCAA, and the market says it's zero. I was concerned that by these universities and by these conferences and the NCAA potentially trying to cap it at fair market value and reinsert themselves into that decision-making process, that we were going to have artificial deflation of the value of these NIL agreements. Luckily, sane people got into the ears of the people making these decisions, apparently, and told them, that feels like we're going to have potential issues, whether it be antitrust issues. So you got Title IX issues, right? But you've also got you've got essentially non-compete. You might have non-compete issues with that. We'll get into that with the shoe deals and the side agreements there, and whether or not you're at a school that allows you to contract an NIL agreement with an existing university sponsor. That's another issue I saw come up that a lot of people sort of abandoned, I think for non-competition reasons. But the big thing here is, and I want to bring this example up. I read a story today about Mackenzie Milton, the former UCF quarterback. He's down at Florida State, and De'Aaron King, the quarterback at Miami, got together. And this has obviously been in the works for months and months and months. They didn't just launch it this morning.
They've been doing it for at least 6 months.
I had a brilliant idea this morning after reading this article for a new business and said, damn it, I should have been doing this for the last 12 months. And I just thought about it today. How can I push this out in the next 6 hours? It's not going to happen. But their idea is brilliant. And I guess somebody got into their ear and saw the same fair market value issues that I saw and that other people apparently saw and said, hold on a second, we're going to go ahead and we're going to determine what the market is. And we're going to do it legitimately. So what they did is they created a website. And Jason, if you can look up the name of it, please look that up for me. But they created a website that posts all the appearance fees that athletes that are currently receiving and will receive from now through whenever they decide to shut the website down. Dreamfield, that's it. So on Dreamfield, you can they have a posting. It's just, I think it's right there on the homepage, and it shows what the actual fees are that athletes are receiving for doing public appearances, who the athlete was, where the appearance was, things like that. It's broken down into a spreadsheet. It's very digestible, very easy to read. And what that does is it cuts the knees out of any university or conference or the NCAA itself trying to say the fair market value of your service is this. So you got paid $60,000 to go speak at this car dealership. We think you should have been given $200, says college or university or conference. Well, now you can say, nuh-uh, I get $60,000 because so-and-so over here in Lincoln, Nebraska got $72,000 to do the exact same thing. I'm just in a different market. So the price that I was paid was absolutely fair. And now you won't have that interference in those agreements. It is more of a free contracting type of situation. I thought that was brilliant. The other thing that they're getting into is they're getting into NFTs, the non-fungible tokens, that thing that's going on now. And I honestly don't even fully understand it. If one of the three of you understand how NFTs work.
I actually
do. What are you buying?
So
like you're buying pieces of a piece of IP, or what is
nothing? It's actually it's worse than that.
It's like Dogecoin, but you got images.
Dogecoin. It's exactly what it is. So basically, an NFT is it's a crypto application. So essentially, what you do with an NFT is you're buying a barcode, to put it in sort of analog terms.
Okay.
You are buying a string of numbers that says you are the owner of this sort of digital parking space that says, so this actually started, the first NFT was an artist who was, selling digital prints and different things. And what he decided to do was to sell basically licensed digital images that he had done, that basically by buying the NFT, you went on the blockchain as you were the actual owner of this. Now, do you actually own anything more than someone else who might download the same thing? No, but you actually are the licit owner of this like collectible.
You've got legal rights. You've got legal rights to that thing. Yeah.
Well, you don't even have legal rights to the thing. You don't.
No.
Oh, really?
You basically just get to say it's mine.
That's right. You get to say that it's yours, but you don't actually have any rights to the object itself. And in some cases, you can sell an NFT that is not actually attached to anything that is tangible in the real world. You can just say, I am, and the NBA, for example, has
NBA got into this. I saw that.
Yeah, they're selling NFTs to like highlights. So there's a highlight video, and the video is posted, and then you can become a part owner of that video that you actually have no rights to do anything with. You can't like take that video and play it for a stadium of people without the NBA giving you rights to do that separately. But you can just say like, I remember this highlight, and I actually liked it so much that I bought it. But that's all you have. You have no rights to the thing itself. It's that. So you want to talk about basically buying nothing. It's the closest thing I can think of to buying nothing while still saying that you're sort of buying something.
Well, they're doing that. Mackenzie Milton and De'Aaron King are doing that, along with they've blasted out to the whole world what these kids are getting for appearances, which I think is brilliant, and it cuts the knees out of any fair market value.
Well, and the NFT thing is the perfect way to launder money, basically. Like,
Well,
you know,
it's the equivalent of naming a star after someone or buying a plot of land.
Oh,
on Mars.
I got you.
That's a great
analogy. Okay, I get it. I understand it now. Thank you.
No,
Look at
it's
that,
literally
John.
just like, I bought that star. Like, okay,
Awesome. Yeah, that star is yours.
yeah,
with the
Congrats.
universe
Yeah.
background behind him.
Yeah.
exactly.
See, John, if you would have had the video the last time, our last conversation would have gone this smooth too.
Thanks.
Thanks for nothing.
But yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And the thing is, NFTs there's an unlimited amount of NFTs that you can sell. So if you're a popular athlete, you can just sell NFTs of whatever you want and have people buy those, and they're buying something that the market value is whatever people are willing to pay. But literally they're just giving you money for nothing.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's go back. I think that clears a lot up. So yeah, so those kids are doing that. They've obviously set
That's super smart.
They've set the market now, or at least they've made the market transparent for what these appearances are going to cost, which I think is a great tool for these kids moving forward. Let's go ahead and clarify here. This is not a loser for the NCAA from a financial standpoint. It's not a loser for the universities. We'll get into how it maybe possibly could be, but in the grand scheme, it's not really a loser for the universities. Because the universities are not permitted to actually compensate the athletes. The universities can't participate in this. Now, what they can do, so they can't arrange NIL agreements.
Right. Just like they couldn't arrange boosters to provide payments beforehand, right?
Exactly. But what universities can do, and actually are expected to do in terms of participation in this process, is that they are expected to take NIL agreements that athletes enter into and review them and make sure that they are in compliance with state law or with the university's policies / both. Once Congress passes federal legislation on this, which I'm certain is going to happen, so that there's some uniformity, and the NCAA is lobbying very hard for it, I should say. This is one thing Congress might actually give them. They won't give them the antitrust exemption, but they might give them this. Once that passes, then schools will have to determine whether these NIL agreements and these arrangements are in line with federal law. And I should also make this point. The way this works is, if you're in a state, per the NCAA's interim guidance, the way this is going to work until the NCAA comes out with their full NIL policy that I assume most universities will adopt once it's out there. If you live in a state right now that has an effective law, an effective NIL law, so we'll use Florida as the example. If you are in Florida today, you have to abide by the law of the state of Florida when it comes to your NIL activities, if you're an athlete or if you're a university, because these NIL laws will cover university conduct as well. If you're in a state that doesn't have a law or doesn't have a law that's effective, then you defer or you default to the conference's policy, or if your university has a policy, you drop one more step down to the university policy. So there's a lot of gap fillers in the way or along the way, but it starts with if you're in a school, in a state that has a law, follow that law. If your state doesn't have an effective law or doesn't have one at all, whether it's proposed and just not effective or they don't have one at all, then you use the school or the conference's guidelines. That's how the NCAA has explained this. That's their interim guidance. Their interim guidance will stay. What they have now, what they have written down, it's only going to get built upon. It's not necessarily going to change. This is just a gap filler right now, so they could at least have something on day one of the rollout for this NIL stuff, because they needed to go ahead and be in line with some of these states that went effective on July 1st. So that's where we are. Some of these schools have restricted, like we were talking about with the shoe thing, Jason, so we'll go and we'll get to that. Some of these schools have decided to restrict athletes from engaging in sponsorships or NIL agreements with existing university or athletics department sponsors. Many schools, most that I've seen, have abandoned this. And I think the reason they've abandoned it is it's essentially forcing your athletes into a non-competition agreement that there's no consideration supporting. This is basic contract law. The
You
students
can't force them if they're not employees.
Yeah, exactly. You're not contracted with the university. You're contracting with an external third party. The university coming in and imposing what amounts to a non-compete seems a little fishy. And I think that's why most schools have abandoned it, but some schools haven't. And this sort of thing matters. So one thing I want to make very clear is that these kids are going to need guidance on how to navigate this stuff. The school you decide to go to, pay very close attention, or the schools you're considering, pay very close attention to what their policies are. Pay very close attention to the resources they have available to you. Many schools, Georgia is a perfect example, have partnered with third parties like Influencer or no cap. Some of these schools, these are all NIL athlete brand building.
North Carolina
services.
has as well, hasn't it, Mike?
And I believe Carolina's partnered with is Influencer. I know Shaq Rashad's working for Influencer, correct?
One of those.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're. I don't know what all three of them do, but there's like a alphabet soup of names.
Yep.
That they've partnered with on the NIL thing.
Yeah. So what they do is their whole goal, or I guess their whole service to the university, they're contract with the university, but what universities are doing is they're setting up essentially NIL departments that are headed by this third party administrator. We'll use Influencer as the example.
And that is the one that UNC has gone with.
That's okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure Shaquille Rashad actually works for them. At least it's what LinkedIn told me very recently. I don't know if he's moved on or not, but that's actually how I learned about it. Was Shaq was posting on Influencer a lot on LinkedIn. So what they do is they're going to essentially teach these kids how to build their brands. They're going to teach them how best to utilize the NIL process. They're going to get them in line in terms of compliance with the school's policy, things like that. But they don't work for the athlete. That's why the NCAA and all of these schools are allowing athletes to have NIL representation. These are not agents. They are agents for NIL purposes. They're not agents in the traditional sense. So what they are prohibited from doing is you're prohibited from contracting with an NIL agent or an NIL representative, who could be a lawyer, could be somebody who provides these type of services, whatever, like a Drew Rosenhaus. But you cannot include in your agreement any promise that I will sign on with you when it comes time to negotiate my pro contract, if I go pro. So there can't be an agreement for future representation services. It is strictly for stay in your lane NIL while you're in college. Kids are going to need help navigating this, and you're going to see an explosion in this industry of services that are going to be available. Like you saw an explosion in recruiting services, we've seen them for a long time, but really in the last 15, 20 years, we saw a real explosion in services that help kids get recruited, navigate recruiting, that sort of thing. You're going to see that now in this NIL space. It's going to start to blow up. Many of these companies got ahead of the curve and they already exist. Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Sanders.
Well, with you and Jason on, I feel like I do have to raise my hand if I'm not going to be a potted plant for the entire.
I'm sorry, this stuff gets me excited.
Podcast.
I'm talking too much. Yeah,
that was me last pod. It's okay, Buck.
So here's my question, or one question.
Yeah.
EA Sports has already said they're going to have a college football game video game in 2023. That's already a done deal. It's going to launch in 2023. They're working on it now. They're not, I wouldn't think they're not going to get a deal with every single player on every single team if they're going to go to the old format of Mike Ingersoll has got a sleeve or whatever on his left elbow or right elbow.
Yeah.
I would think there would have to be some collective part of this where all the athletes at all the Power 5 schools or whatever schools are involved in EA Sports get a cut of the pie for being represented in the game.
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? Because it's
you're getting into collective bargaining now.
Yeah,
well, they've already got a model of this for the NFL though. I mean,
yeah, but the NFL has a players association,
right?
But they can collectively bargain. But what about college athletes?
Well, so you've got an issue, right? You have an issue with current NIL policies at all these universities that you either wholesale cannot use marks or logos in pursuing compensation for use of your NIL, or if you do, you have to pay a licensing fee to the university, which I actually think is a very fair. I frankly think that's a fair compromise, the licensing fee component of it. But if you're at a school that doesn't allow you to use marks and logos, then EA Sports is going to have to negotiate with the university a waiver of that part of their policy in order to get those kids to check. But the kids are going to have to be a part of that too. And without essentially union representation or the ability to collectively bargain and have a seat at the table, they're gonna have a very hard time negotiating that sort of deal. So the complication is you have essentially a built-in all stop for some schools that adopt a policy that doesn't allow you to use marks or logos, or if there's a state law, if that state's law doesn't allow you to use the university's mark or logo in pursuing NIL compensation, when that game comes out, they're going to have Alabama is going to have a maroon helmet, a crimson helmet with a number on the side. And UNC is going to have a Carolina blue helmet with Argyle down the middle and a UNC logo stamped on the side.
And they're not, my belief is they're not going to have some generic person playing quarterback in 2023. It's going to be a Bryce Young lookalike with a Bryce Young number.
Yep.
So how does that Bryce Young get compensated? Which, if you go back to the O'Bannon case, that's what got all this started to begin with. You know, you haven't solved the original problem. So my guess is some really smart organization is working on this right now. How do we pull this off? Either through the licensing, maybe the university is involved somehow. Maybe some.
Except they can't be.
They can't pay the players.
You see the complicated. This is what makes this so thorny. And Buck. I mean, this is a fantastic point. Leave it to all the world wisdom that Buck Sanders has. Thank you, Buck, for getting us back.
You're welcome.
If we just let him talk, this would be an easier conversation. It's my fault. But yeah, these are the thorny issues because the school can't be involved in arranging compensation for these athletes' use of their NIL. They can only be involved in reviewing the agreements and making sure they're in line with state law or the university's policy and don't otherwise offend, the university.
Is it being involved if they waive the logo and marks thing for this one specific enterprise?
If it's waivable, if you got a state law in place, it may not be waivable.
Yeah.
These are things that legislators are going to have to think about as they're crafting these. Like North Carolina, for example, has a proposed bill. It was proposed in the Senate Bill 324. It was proposed back on March 18th, but it hasn't been voted on. And right now it has a projected effective date, even if it does pass both houses and then the governor signs it. It has a projected effective date of 2024. Now that's going to have to get bumped up. It's just the way it's going to have to go. But they can obviously default back to the ACC's policy or UNC's policy in the meantime. But the state of North Carolina currently doesn't have legislation that's effective. But once they do, and go ahead and I'll actually pull the proposed legislation here. I believe it has a marks or logos prohibition in it.
I don't know if it's even out of committee yet, that bill, because I was following that a little bit. But my thing was this, you mentioned Shaquille Rashad working for the NIL things. Well, if universities are going to have these NIL groups help out the athletes, who's paying those NIL groups? Is that
the athletes?
So the athletes are paying the NIL, but UNC, so the university connects, they pick which NIL group they want to use.
So back up. So this is a point that we stopped talking about it before I was able to get this out. Now I realize it happened. Let me clear up some confusion. These NIL groups like Influencer or No Cap, for example, they're contracted with the university. The school's paying them. They don't arrange compensation. They just teach brand building. Think of it that way.
Okay.
They are like a new compliant. They're like an outside compliance department just for NIL. The outside companies that you actually contract with, they're the ones. That's your representation. Those companies will also exist. They will be contracted with the athlete, not with the university. And it's those third-party companies. There's a few of them. There's not a lot of them, but there's a few of them that exist right now. They will be the ones that take a cut, most likely. I would assume this is what the contract would look like. They'll get a percentage of every payout that you get pursuant to that NIL agreement.
Speaking of compliance, if I can jump in,
I'll allow
again.
it.
I need to stop talking. You go nuts.
With the consent of the committee, I'll extend my remarks. So in terms of compliance, let's say NIL, as we know it right this minute, went into effect in 2008, 2009. And Marvin Alston and Greg Little are knocking down whatever they're knocking down on NIL in 2010 when the NCAA shows up on campus and says, "Hey, we want to talk to you guys." Is there any chance that those guys are going to go in and talk to the NCAA without legal representation?
No.
And if the NCAA does anything to them, they have real damages in real time. I'm making X amount of money per month doing NIL stuff, and if you suspend me for any period of games and it turns out later you shouldn't have, I'm going to sue you to Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that, how does that, what are we looking at in terms of NCAA compliance these days when they're, you know, same scenario, 2022, hopefully not involving North Carolina. Let's say they go to South Carolina and
they wouldn't have the players for it.
They pull Luke Dottie in, or whatever his name is, Dottie.
The fact that you're not even sure tells you that it's
yeah,
it's
I'm not even
implausible
sure.
to go
yeah,
to happen.
Maybe not. Maybe that's a bad example, but you get the point.
Yeah.
You're going to pull that guy in, and for some matters, like Robert Quinn could have got all the jewelry he wanted to under this legislation, right? I mean, under this program, jewelry store
tattoos for all the Ohio State players,
right?
Shoes for Florida State players.
Yeah. No, none of that is
the laptops for Cam Newton.
Whatever. Yeah. How many of those did he have? Laptops, like
not enough, apparently.
But I mean, it wipes out one entire angle of compliance, right, for the NCAA.
For the most part, what you're identifying is if you get held out. So Buck's example, his hypothetical is you get held out for X number of games, and that has a monetary value attached to it. From the civil side, that would require that contract to most likely have a rider in there that says, if you're suspended for any games, then this contract's null and void, or your compensation will skip whatever period, and you won't be paid for whatever period you're suspended. There's a thorniness in that also, from a practical standpoint, that you can't be compensated on these NIL agreements. And this, again, this is a restriction that makes sense. You can't be compensated for your athletic performance. So me playing I can't be paid based on me being in the game. Now, my athletic performance can enhance my NIL value, but it can't be the quote unquote consideration or the basis of that agreement. Now, in your example, we will figure out ways to contract around this. So you will figure out a way to have the rider where you got to be on the field, but that's not the reason why you're being paid. But it is I don't want to call it a force majeure clause, but it's the type of thing that could put you in default of your agreement if you end up getting suspended.
Well, the easy thing,
NCAA compliance might actually get cleaner. Because of that.
Easy way to do this is that you basically say, look, if there's you put a character clause in or something like that, so that
a morality clause,
and then as soon as you get suspended for breaking rules or something like that, then you're wiped out, no problem.
Yeah. It'll say that for the duration of the contract, the athlete must remain in good academic and adhere to all eligibility standards. It'll be some language like that.
So the students, the athletes might even start policing themselves from an NCAA enforcement standpoint. The NCAA may not have another job to do for the rest of their existence.
I mean, that's a good point.
I'm not losing money because of this. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'm not getting kicked off the field and losing money because of this stuff.
The one coach told me a couple of years ago that like the toughest period of time for coaching is like once spring practice is over and the kids are released and they go back home or whatever, because you got to worry about what they're doing, how late they're staying out at night, and this, that, and the other. But I mean, there's certainly going to have to be some restrictions on these NIL contracts. If you have a situation like you had at Baylor or you know, now LSU or Tennessee, I think, may have had also issues where a kid gets charged with some morally reprehensible crime.
Virginia Tech, the kid right now facing murder charges.
There you go. An influencer is not going to be paying that kid, you know, if he's can't make bail on a second-degree murder charge. I mean,
contractually, I think that's entirely defensible, and under the current NCAA NIL guidance, I think that's entirely defensible too.
So my thought is that, and when it comes to, you know, the limitations, from what I've been reading, it sounds like the NCAA is largely going to punt that to the states, and if not the states, then the conferences. Is that roughly y'all's understanding?
Yep.
Yes,
or then to the schools after that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I want to add a couple things here that have come up along the way. One is I'm curious to see how this filters down to, you know, Mike, you mentioned the explosion of recruiting sites and things like that. I mean, of which Inside Carolina is part of the 24/7 network. You know, that's a big deal. Well, I'm curious to see how this impacts, say, coverage of recruiting for, you know, athletes who are now in high school and they don't have to worry about NIL situations going into college. How many of these kids say, look, if you want a recruiting update from me, you're going to have to pay me? How many of these situations?
You know, Jason, you could just stop talking about that right now. You know, I mean,
you know full well.
Let's not do that. Let's move on to a different topic.
I know what happens. I get my pink slip from Inside Carolina when we make cuts.
Yeah,
that's exactly.
But I mean, you know full well that I'm not the one that's introducing this part of the discussion. I mean, I saw this on Twitter earlier today. It was
it's a great point.
Well,
so the NIL. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
I said, well, wouldn't age come into effect? Because if you're talking with high school kids, they're not legal adults, and in some states, there's a lot of limitations on the ability for minors to enter into contracts.
Yes. So one thing that is the one glaring thing here that isn't getting a lot of press, and my business idea, I should probably keep my mouth shut, but I'm not going to.
No, keep quiet. This is for after the pod.
Yeah, this
is like a what's that guy's name? Ron somebody. I had the right to remain silent. I just didn't have the ability.
Yeah, Ron White. Yeah. But so the NIL stuff doesn't. There's no restrictions on high school kids setting up these agreements going into college. So there's a restriction on a college kid signing on with a NIL representative or an agent. And in that agreement, agreeing that you're going to be my agent for my pro contract if I go pro for future services. There's no restriction on entering into an NIL agreement if you're underage, right, with your parents' consent in high school, and having that agreement carry over into college, so long as that agreement doesn't say, if you get into X school, then this agreement becomes active, or if you go to this program, or if you don't go to this program. If it doesn't steer you to or away from a certain university, but just says, once you're in college, we'll represent you for NIL purposes, there's nothing based on how it's all currently written. There's nothing stopping that. Now, that's a big gap. That's a big hole. And that might actually come to be. But what you do have is what John pointed out is the protection of parents. So minor status forces the parents to become involved in that process. So that may not end up being legislated because legislators and the NCAA and universities and conferences will all understand that these kids, if they're under 18 years old, are going to have their parents involved in the process. And you would presume, not always the case, but you would presume that the parents would have the child's best interest at heart and would steer that child in the right direction. So that would be the state doesn't need to protect, or the university or the conferences or the NCAA doesn't need to protect those high school kids or those prospective athletes, because their parents should be doing that job for them. So they might not get involved at all.
One other thing to throw into the mix under Jason's hypothetical is that kids, and you've seen this if you paid any attention at all, kids being recruited use a recruiting process to build their social media presence.
Oh yeah.
And if they're going to tell the variety of recruiting services or whatever, you're going to have to charge. You're going to have to pay us to do this. they're
Killing
actually undercutting themselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because you know, you see guys being recruited that'll post and say, "Hey, I'm so and so. I'm considering XYZ schools. Help me. I've got 5,000 followers. Help me get to 10,000. Blah 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 blah."
Mhm.
So really, the whole point there is to build their social media following, and if you're one of ever how many kids that are being recruited, you want to build as big a social following as you possibly can. So I don't see that as an issue for 24/7 or for Inside Carolina moving forward,
Yeah.
because what we're doing, in essence, is helping them build their social following through the recruiting process. So
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we are in so many ways. I mean, you think about what 24/7 does, even, I mean, before the NIL ability to benefit from that. Getting exposure on 24/7 or on, you know, any of the other recruiting services, that is exposure for those athletes with colleges, you know, the combines and things, and the various things that all these sites have done. That's major exposure for these kids. And then you add to that the social media following and all of those things where, you know, when you write an article about a kid, people suddenly go and they find that kid's Twitter account or his Instagram account, and all of a sudden that's a few more followers. And you're absolutely right, Buck, that that would be trying to kill the golden goose to get at the eggs by saying, oh, well, you know, I'm going to try to go for it here. No, the thing to do is to say, hey, can you write an extra, or I'll give you an extra free update here. I'd like one more crack at the headline so that I can get 20 more followers tonight. That sort of thing is really where that goes. There's one other thing that John, you said that I thought was really important a little while back, which was the point about schools backing off of the non-compete type stuff, because then, you know, you can't do that with people who aren't employees. Well, that's the real catch-22 of all of this is, and that's why we kind of skimmed over it a little bit, but you think about that. If the very last thing that the NCAA or the universities want is anything that amounts to a concession that these athletes are actually employees, right? That's what they're trying to avoid. That is the one thing. Like, is there anything that we're doing that would give anybody any indication that these athletes are employees? And if so, we need to stop that. Well, there you go. That's why that's
going to happen, though, Jason.
It will.
That's going to happen.
It will, but they're going to try to stave that off as long as they can.
And that's why the universities are prohibited from paying the students, because that is the biggest, most obvious control thing or participation thing in this that the universities could do that makes them look like employers.
Just like we talked about in the Austin case in Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence, he talked about college athletes as if they were employees. He never said they were employees, but he said no other industry could get away with treating its workers this way, right? You know, that this is just, and he would continually use industry and workers, referring to colleges or the NCAA and players. So he's once you start building that language is what controls everything. You know, it controls us all basically. And once you start using that language to define what the NCAA is, industry, and define what players are, workers, and then ultimately it's going to weave its way into the legal system, and that's how things are going to go. Might take a while. I mean, the O'Bannon case came out, it started in 2009, here we are 2021, took a little while to get here, but it's going to happen. So rather than do what the NCAA has done all these years, is deny, counter accuse, which was my favorite motto by the way, and one I used most when I was attempting to, when I did have a dorsal fin. That was my favorite motto. And so rather than do that though, why not let's figure out a way to get where we want to go and compensate athletes the way we want to compensate them without trying to reinvent the English language.
Yeah. So as I say, I wanted to kind of start getting the conversation to a topic that I know the message boards are going to be super interested in, because you've already seen it pop up in terms of recruiting. I mean, is it going to be a recruiting advantage if the SEC basically says, you know, if your NIL passes the most cursory test imaginable, congratulations, rake in the money, while you have maybe the ACC or the Pac-12 or some others saying, well, we're actually going to take a deeper look at this. I mean, how do you guys see that playing out in the actual real practical application of this stuff?
It's going to be
go first if I can.
Go ahead.
Go, Buck.
I had a recruit tell me, and he was recruited probably 25 years ago. Went on a official visit to Texas, and while he was there, they gave him a pair of snakeskin cowboy boots, and inside the boot was a big old fat wad of cash.
Mac Brown doesn't do that, Buck.
This was
25 years
before.
ago.
This is pre-Mac.
Pre-Mac.
Yeah.
And Jason is way more outspoken on this topic than I am. What SEC school hasn't been handing wads of cash to recruits, you know, the booster handshakes?
For those who are only listening, Jason cannot nod his head. He can't nod his head harder right now.
So, you know, how is it going to benefit the SEC when, in effect, now all schools can do that? You know,
And as a big point, Buck, so the NCAA has made it clear in their guidance that relationships with boosters are to be encouraged and not discouraged. So you can't restrict athletes from getting into contracts with boosters who own a business locally. Because as the NCAA,
if Sam Howell isn't driving a Tesla next year, then he's sleeping on it, right?
Yeah. But boosters provide a valuable service in terms of network building and relationship building to the university. And just because the booster gave $1,000, just because the guy who owns the Burger King franchise down the street also gave $1,000 to the program last year, should not be a reason why you're not allowed to now go get a sponsorship deal with that booster. So the NCAA recognizes the inherent concerns, the $100 handshakes from these boosters, but they also feel like if these athletes are going to have a real opportunity to benefit off of this stuff, and this is the NCAA saying it's not out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing this so they don't get sued. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, but the NCAA's position is that your best opportunity to actually monetize yourself and to take advantage of this new NIL freedom is to work with local businesses. And most of those local businesses, especially in college towns, are all going to be owned by boosters or alumni. And if you were to wipe out the allowance for athletes to go and work with boosters and contract with boosters, then you'd wipe out almost every opportunity for the lower level guys who we've talked about here, or the lower level girls on some of these Olympic sport teams, to actually make money off of this, because the smaller businesses are going to be, that's going to be their golden goose. The local tire shop and the local ice cream shop and, Yopo right there on Franklin Street. That's going to be the best shot for some of these athletes. And if you wipe out the boosters, Sutton's, you wipe out the boosters, well, who's left to actually contract with if you're one of those folks?
Now, you mentioned that, a booster who owns a business can contract with the player to do that or whatever. Where this really gets wild is with the NFTs. Mm-hmm. Forget $100 handshake. I'm going to buy your NFT. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How much is this NFT? $250. You got it.
Yeah.
Why don't you make this one? Why don't you make this one $1,500? Because I'd really, really like a more rare NFT. Yep. There's all sorts of ways of doing this, and it does become the Wild West. But I think Buck's point on this is that everybody who's wanted to be competitive, and I mean everybody who's wanted to be competitive, has already been doing this sort of thing under the table for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And some programs are much better at it and have much stronger networks built in than others to be able to do this. And one of the things that's happened is a lot of that money gets funneled through other channels to launder it. So private schools, churches, coaches, all sorts of things end up taking their cut. What this ends up doing is it brings a lot of that stuff above the table, so that, first of all, you can kind of see across the board, like they're doing this, we can do that, or, well, we can't match up with that. Well, that's a good thing in terms of the programs that want to be competitive, and other programs that may not have the networks to do some of the same things. This has been going on from the beginning, and it will go on with or without NFT legislation. And now that this is available, now that it's above the table, there's very little reason for a lot of these networks now with the $100 handshakes to be working below the table, when you can just buy some NFTs for a kid that are above the table. What difference does it make?
The differentiation between these programs is going to be the resources that they offer from the university side. Again, your influencer and your no cap, those benefits. How's the university going to provide you resources that will help you build your brand and help you make more money? How are they going to do that?
That's who's going to provide an accountant, because let's not forget about that.
Well, these kids are going to learn what income taxes are real quick.
Yeah. I mean, that's a legit thing. Is before, a $500 wad of cash in a boot, no one's reporting that. The IRS has no clue. But these NFTs and NILs, those are being reported.
It's all coming with W-9s. It's all going to be.
Well, actually, a lot of these, it's going to be worse, because it won't come with a W-9, because it'll be, contract work that doesn't require it, because it'll be below the threshold, which means you need to report it, but you don't have the paperwork for it, which is that much worse. Trust me, I've been down that road.
And you'll be getting kids getting a 1099 all of a sudden and wonder, whoa,
what do I do with this?
Yeah.
Now, the difference here is that schools that did that sort of thing, and who knows who's done it. Am I going to swear that nobody at North Carolina has ever handed, a recruit a wad of cash? I'm sure Mike has still got money squirreled away in his, hidden all around his apartment or whatever.
Mike's got a kid now. He doesn't have money.
No comment. On both. No comment on both.
But at the same time, I think one of the things, going back historically for North Carolina, is that even back to before the World War, North Carolina had
when Buck was in school,
a certain amount of thanks for that, Mike. Mr. Elbow Sleeve on NCAA.
Cut Mike's feed real quick here, guys. Hold on.
Are you back? What are we doing here?
No, I was just messing. Continue your train of thought, Buck, that Mike and I completely took you off.
El Jefe thought you were serious there.
No.
El Jefe.
Here we go. This is a serious point, which is that North Carolina thought of itself as a public Ivy.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came to football specifically, and the Daily Tar Heel was leader of this back in the day, they had a fit when they hired the coach from Maryland that died of a tick bite. His name is on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of it right now.
He was only here for like a minute. Yeah. God, who was that?
In any event, when he was hired, it was like, oh, this is the end of the world. We know it. They're hiring professional gunslingers as coaches. These guys should be, PE instructors, who just coach football on the side or whatever, and more so with football than with basketball. North Carolina had always thought of
Jim Tatum.
itself. There you go. It was on the tip of my tongue. I couldn't think of it.
Who was it, Jason?
Jim Tatum.
Jim Tatum.
That's right. That's right.
And so there was always this pearl clutching and so going on with the football program, because we don't want big time sports. We don't want to be like the SEC and those the great unwashed, at the University of Alabama and Louisiana State. We don't want to be like those people. We want to keep, athletics pure, at North Carolina. Well, there's not everybody, but there was a segment of the powers that be at the University of North Carolina that really fought hard and had this idea that we don't want big time football because it's dirty in Chapel Hill. It drags our reputation down. Well, this helps in that regard, because if it's all above board and, it's the law, it's the lay of the land, nobody can get upset if, these NFTs or whatever you're calling them, people are paying these things because it's the lay of the land now. It's above board, it's legal. It's not a $100 handshake from the local owner of a strip club or what have you. I'm just saying.
What you're saying is it's compatible with the, quote unquote Carolina way. And I do think that makes a big difference in terms of how many people in, say, the North Carolina family are willing to get on board with that sort of thing. I think that's absolutely huge.
Doesn't that advantage only have to do with athletes once they're on campus? I mean, how is that going to affect kids when they're still getting recruited?
Strength of brand.
Well, yeah, the
$100 handshake. The $100 handshake is to get the kid on campus in the first place. Once he's on campus, great. The benefits are the NIL benefits and everything, and all the resources the school provides. From the third party administrator of the NIL department's great. All that's wonderful. But you still got to get that kid onto campus, and that high school kid, $100 handshake might actually still be the way to do it.
Well, I think
we're muddying. Buck's point is a great one, but I think we're starting to muddy things a little bit. There is a line between prospect and actually on campus. And the NIL stuff, again, we talked about how it could potentially help. A prospect could potentially monetize that and take advantage of it, but there's really no real advantage until you're on campus and you're supported by the brand of the school that you're at.
But you could still pay prospects, love to see you in Chapel Hill kind of thing. And it's not contingent on, going to, there are lots of ways that you can contractually work this out.
Yes, there are.
To do this above board, even with prospects. I mean, it's a little trickier, but you can definitely do it. So, those of you out there who are, inclined in this direction should probably already be thinking about that.
This is where boosters are going to become a problem. Is the prospect side, not the already on campus side. It's the prospect side. That'll be the issue, because
I think the biggest selling point is going to be during recruiting when they go on visits and they're talking to the other players. How much did you make last month?
Well, that's what I was going to say is
how much did you make last year?
The smart recruiting departments are going to have an entire spread that says in the year of 2022, the LSU football team averaged X dollars from NFT and NIL, right?
Which is going to be easy for them because there's mandatory disclosure requirements under all these state laws and under the current on every conference and university policy I've seen and the NCAA policy. There's mandatory disclosure of your agreement.
That's going to be the recruiting pitch. Is here's what your potential earnings are. Not here's $100, go have a good time, get yourself a steak or whatever at $15 a pound these days.
But a recruit entering into an NIL agreement, which again we've already established, we know this. We know this is how it works, at least right now, till they change it. High school prospects can enter into NIL agreements. The issue is if you enter into an NIL agreement with like a booster, for a specific school. There is a prohibition on steering players towards certain schools. That agreement will be deemed null and void. Okay, the school can invalidate that, or the NCAA can come in and invalidate that agreement if you're being directed to sign onto a certain school or to not sign with a certain school. Okay, so you can contract with very specific people, or you can contract with anyone you want, but that pool is much narrower and it's much more concentrated when you're at the prospect level than once you're actually on campus, because you have to eliminate, essentially, from a practical standpoint, any booster for any school or any person who has ties and could be considered a booster to any university, because your contract could potentially be invalidated. And then you might have disgorgement issues in terms of giving back all the money you earned from it. And there's all kinds of enforcement problems with that actually haven't been fleshed out from what I've seen by most schools or the NCAA yet. The penalties component of this is going to be the next big development. Is how is this going to be enforced, and what will the penalties be from on high at the university and also from the NCAA. We know that the NCAA bylaws still are gap fillers and they still apply in certain areas, like the agency issue. Bylaw number 12 that governs amateurism is still going to apply to an agent situation if you contract for future services as opposed to just your NIL. We know that's true, but how are the schools going to handle this from a penalty standpoint? That remains to be seen, because I haven't seen at least a final version of a penalty system that I think is workable yet.
And man, is that going to be complicated. So this also leads to another thing that, Mike, you said we'd get to, and I think it's probably right about now that we should, is that there are some possible ways. I mean, people have asked whether this is going to hurt the schools. And by and large, I agree. It's not going to hurt the schools. The one place that it has the potential to hurt the schools is actually in the booster situation, in terms of boosters who were giving so much money to the school in certain functions.
Here we go. Yep.
Might be more inclined to take that money
directly
and to pay those athletes directly, in order, because I mean, why was I giving this much money per month or per year to the school? Because I want my school to succeed. Well, if I want my school to succeed, I'm going to pay the athletes to make sure that they're getting on campus.
Which is exactly why I think a lot of these schools initially wanted to restrict contracting directly with athletes, getting into NIL agreements directly with existing school or athletics department sponsors, because they're worried about exactly what you just said. Coca-Cola is going to say, God almighty, I'm paying North Carolina $40,000 a year to have my logo plastered up in the Dean Dome and on the football field and field hockey stadium and a Boshemer baseball stadium. I could just pay these athletes a fraction of that and I get the same exposure. They could just wear Coca-Cola shirts around campus and everybody knows who they are. And I'm getting the same, I'm getting some of the same benefit. That's the concern. That's why I think those restrictions against, entering into contracts with existing sponsors, why that was originally a big consideration for a lot of these schools. But again, I think they dumped it because that's like a de facto non-compete.
Yeah. And it's an employment, you're declaring
that's
an
employment issue. Yeah. It's an employment issue.
So in the choice between declaring them employees or allowing them to potentially compete, we're going to allow them to compete.
Same thing with shoe deals. So this is something I've seen on the message boards and you brought it up earlier. It's the same concept with a shoe deal. It's going to be hard for a school to say that, there's one out, and I'll get to it in a second, and I'll actually read it from the proposed North Carolina legislation, but I see it in pretty much everybody's. It's going to be really hard for a Nike school to tell an athlete that you can't contract with Adidas and wear Adidas in your off time because Adidas competes with us. And it's going to be hard for the university to try and invalidate that NIL agreement and say, well, we're a Nike school. You can't wear Adidas in your off time. They can say you can't wear Adidas while you're in team activities, because every restriction I've seen, and this is another one I agree with, you can't engage in NIL activity during scheduled team activities. So you can't wear Adidas while you're at practice or while you're, getting on the team bus or traveling for a game or, with the team, because our sponsor is Nike. But it's really hard for the university to say you can't enter into that Adidas agreement on the side, because now you're in that non-compete area. Like, you're literally you can't enter to a competitor sponsor from the sponsor, the team that sponsors our school. Their only out is the proposed North Carolina legislation, again, this is Senate Bill 324. You have to ensure that the contract terms don't conflict with a provision of the student athlete's team contract. I don't know what team contracts are saying these days. Okay. But if you had a team contract, you come in day one during your, when you sign all your NCAA paperwork and stuff during training camp with football. You remember this, Jason?
Oh yeah.
And nobody ever reads those contracts, but let's say that one of those contracts says we are a Nike school and you agree to wear exclusively Nike. That's your team contract. You got state legislation in almost every state that has these passed, and most of these universities have very similar language in their prohibitions or in their NIL laws, or I guess policies, that say you can't enter into an NIL agreement that conflicts with your team contract. So if your team contract says we're a Nike school, you got to wear exclusively Nike gear when you're enrolled here at this university, right? Even in your off time. An agreement with Adidas to wear Adidas in your non-team activity time is going to conflict with your team contract, and that might be the way they can do it. And I may have just given schools, a good idea that I wish I hadn't done, and I'm sorry to everybody that's on campus right now.
Yeah, I still think that would be really tough.
monetize.
I still think that would be really tough to enforce on the,
I agree.
on the side of,
They'll get sued over it.
They would get sued,
but I think
and
they've got. I think that they have an argument. They can fight it and make it expensive.
Yeah,
for the student or the student's agent or marketing team, whoever's representing him.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, look, we've been talking for probably over an hour now. Let's go ahead, wrap it up with just some quick thoughts. And I mean, what's the immediate future going to look like here? Let's go ahead and wrap it up with that. Let's just go around the room. Jason, let's start with you and just go to whoever after that.
So, I mean, I think the biggest thing is we're going to see social media and be a major feature for the best athletes on their teams across a variety of sports. And I think you're going to see a lot of athletes who might not have been inclined in this direction, really working on managing their brand from day one and trying very hard to be active and managing their public front in order to maximize their value. You're going to see a lot of athletes. I mean, you already saw athletes on social media. You're going to see more and more athletes trying to push that kind of brand building up front and making that an important part of what they see as their current career. And I think that's going to be something, especially in the non-revenue sports, that's going to be a major factor that's going to help a lot of these athletes. And it's also going to differentiate some of these major brand schools, where I think some of the haves and the have-not situations in the non-revenue sports, where you only have a few teams that have major followings, that's probably going to further tip the balance for some of those schools. But beyond that, I mean, I'm really curious to see how some of these contracts get worked out and who ends up signing with whom. And I think it's going to be actually kind of fun to look at, who's signing with what food, with what restaurant or whatever, to see, oh, he likes to eat there, or he, just happens to have gotten a good deal. I think that's going to be interesting. And I'm also curious to see how this works out with boosters in the near future.
Yep. Whose face is going to be on the blue cups at He's Not.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and I'll jump in. I'll let Buck finish, because I'm sure he'll have a great closing. For me, I don't think this isn't going to be the destruction of the college sports product. There's a lot of, I guess, college athletics purists that think this is going to make this professional sports. This doesn't make this any more professional than the Olympics already are.
The Olympics, exactly.
And no one, the demand for the Olympics isn't any less because Michael Phelps was doing Subway commercials. It's just not. This will not destroy the college sports product. What makes college sports great is your tie to your school and the pride you have in your university or the university that you follow and that you're a fan of. There's a personal connection there that doesn't exist in professional sports. College sports can never be professional sports for that reason. The personal connection just isn't there in the same way at the pro level. When you have a personal connection to your university and to your campus, even if you never went there, that is something special, and it's something that will never, no matter the endorsement deals these kids are getting, that will never go away. So the college product isn't going to be destroyed by this. What this does do is it will actually, I think, build a lot more community engagement, and it will build, especially in these college towns, you think of Blacksburg or a Chapel Hill, okay? It's going to make these college towns much more college towny. There's going to be a stronger tie to the university because, like Dean Smith said, sports are the front porch of the university. They're the first thing people see, and they're the thing people think about, and it's really the window dressing. That's what gets everybody really interested, for the most part, and hyped up about the school. You're going to have local businesses contracting with these athletes. Those athletes are going to be there. They're going to be making appearances. It's going to be fun for fans on game day. It's going to be fun for people in the off season. There's going to be just more of a community connection there, because now those businesses can be directly tied in. Whereas maybe before they couldn't afford a sponsorship or a vendor cart in Kenan Stadium on a Saturday, they can now afford to get they can get Brian Anderson under contract for some NIL stuff, and they'll give him, a couple $1,000 a year, maybe, that isn't even close to what the sponsorship to the university or the athletics department wanted them to pay was. And now they can have that connection, and they can be tied into the program in a way that they weren't before. And everybody, I'm thinking, big kumbaya powwow. I think this is going to be a much better situation for building community engagement than people are giving it credit for. And if you really want to support these athletes, follow them on social media, buy the products they're pushing, help them out, because you don't know the terms of those contracts, but I'd be willing to bet that if you buy something, they get a cut of it. So help these kids out. They're still college kids. Until we start seeing the data of kids making millions of dollars a year, just remember that most of them aren't. And this is fun. It's no different than the Olympics now. Doesn't make it pro sports. And I think it's actually going to enhance the community engagement. So with that, Buck, you want to take us out?
Well, I think there's always a tendency when these things are fresh and new to overestimate the impact of it. To think, well, and we heard this in connection with the transfer portal and making athletes immediately eligible to play if they transfer. If you look at the impact of the transfer portal, there's some, but it's not anything like free agency in, professional sports. And I think maybe even name, image, and likeness might have an impact on kids going into transfer portal. If they're making X amount of dollars at UNC, and they're not really getting too much playing time, but they're making decent money, are they really going to transfer to Old Dominion? That kind of thing.
Community attachment may actually keep more kids on the roster for longer. Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a really good point.
So, I think you will have to see it play out over time, and before we can really truly talk about this in any sensible way. But it's I think a step in the right direction. And on a variety of fronts, I think it'll help parity in college football to some degree. It might encourage players to stay with the team that they sign with and those kinds of things. But overall, I think it's easy to get, like Mike says, being a purist. Oh, it's a professional sport now. It's not that. So, we have to find out really what it is down the road, but we're not moving into the, somebody had a contract expire in soccer today, $674 million over 4 years.
Lionel Messi.
It's not that. So, keep your shirt on, and we'll get through this.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, hey, appreciate everyone joining me tonight to talk about this. We'll just continue to maybe do these podcasts throughout the year as more things come out, because it really is a very interesting and a topic that's going to have a lot of twists and turns in it over the course of the next few seasons. So we'll be here at Inside Carolina to break it all down for everyone. But for tonight, for myself, Mike Ingersoll, Jason Staples, and Buck Sanders, wishing everyone a good night.